Assalamu alaikum, you're watching Views and News and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about a very important issue, and that is about the ISK, the Islamic State of Khorasan threat, not only to Pakistan or Afghanistan or for the neighboring countries such as Iran, but perhaps for the entire region. We have already witnessed what they have done in the Middle East, the way they have destroyed cities, the way they have torched the historical museums out there, and the kind of chaos they created, the number of people they killed and how they killed. That is something which is of prime concern. And interestingly, these people are not only from the Middle East or perhaps from Afghan side or Pakistan or Turkmenistan or Uzbek or Tajik perhaps. Even people from places like Germany, like UK were a part of that campaign that was sponsored by certain intelligence agencies against some Muslim countries in the Middle Eastern region. But now, as we always knew that this threat could also pose something of prime concern for countries like Pakistan. And recently, about a year and a half ago, we still remember that certain bomb blasts and certain such activities were claimed by none other than the ISK. So there is a difference. It is also believed that a lot of splinter groups of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan join hands with them. And it is also known that these certain groups, which are around 6,000 to 8,000 according to certain analysts, according to some other, they are less than that. But even if there is a single member of that kind of a group who is living, is being supported, financed, trained, and then they are given a certain target to go after. And then we hear that a mosque is blown, na'uzubillah, in Afghanistan, killing 100 people, 60 people, so on and so forth. I mean, they don't care whether they are ready to hit and go for the hard targets or the soft targets. The actual result is about the killing of those people, and this is how they are paid and taken care of. Now, since this threat is also prevailing in Afghanistan and perhaps Pakistan is really concerned about it, we've also asked the Taliban regime to make sure that these people should be eliminated. But I think the Taliban, they have too much in their plate at the moment, whether the pressure through China to look after the issues on their extreme eastern borders, or you talk about the issue related to Hazara people for Iran, or Uzbeks or Tajiks, or perhaps the other minorities also in Afghanistan. But now, since this is a reality, one has to in fact find a solution. They need to have a proper remedy to make sure that this threat is initially eroded and later on is totally terminated, and these people should be either expelled or killed. Simple as that. There is no other way out. Whereas the concept of Islam is concerned, these are not the representatives of Islam. They are just using the name of the religion for their own personal agenda and for the agenda of certain intelligence agencies who are playing a very, very dirty role in this particular region. As according to a lot of Indian analysts, they believe that chaos in Afghanistan means a success for the Indians. And perhaps that is what we don't want, because we believe that peace in Afghanistan means peace in Pakistan. But let me quickly introduce you to our panelists who have joined us for our today's program. We have with us Dr. Tughral Yamin Saab, who is a senior analyst, a writer, and also he writes columns about this very important issues related to the international relations. Thank you very much for your time, Tughral Saab. And we have with us from Moscow, Russia, Dr. Andrey Kortunov, Affairs Council, RIAC. He's the Director, Russian International Affairs. Basically, as I earlier mentioned, that this council is known as RIAC. And I would also like to thank Dr. Andrey for his presence in our program. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you so much for your time. And later on, after about 8:30, we'll also be joined in by Mr. Kamran, Yousaf, who is a senior journalist, anchor person, a columnist and a writer and an expert on international relations. But let me start off from you, Dr. Tughral. First of all, sir, initially nobody believed that this ISK, the Islamic State of Khorasan, existed. But sir, it is not about a certain phenomena. It's about a number of people or a certain group assigned a certain task, assigned a certain assignment, I would say, to create chaos and to kill people and to make sure that the certain country for which they have been given that task should bleed. Sir, we have also learned that so many bomb blasts that unfortunately killed hundreds of people in Pakistan, those responsibilities were claimed by ISK. Their presence, sir, also means that this is not the first time that these people have been brought in from countries like Middle East, or all those fighters who were on a run from the Middle Eastern side, especially in Iraq and in Syria. And then the concept of those mystery helicopters, I mean, they were brought in from those areas and they were stationed or based in Afghanistan and close to the Pakistani border in particular, sir. Now, they have been assigned a certain task to make sure that Afghanistan should be destabilized, and that effect should be seen in Pakistan also. And sir, this is exactly what is going on. Perhaps a lot of people, a lot of splinter groups of the TTP and also the Afghan Taliban, they have joined hands with them, sir. And they are gaining strength from each, after each and every passing day, I would say. Is this a real threat, sir? Is this a manageable threat? Or it is going to be something, which is going to be there, but they will be camouflaged, because it is very difficult to, separate a Taliban from somebody from Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or somebody from ISK, or somebody else, because they are Uzbeks, they are Tajiks, they are, it's a mixture, sir, perhaps. Your take.
Faisal Saab, the Islamic State phenomenon began a few years ago, and it started from Syria and Iraq, where a proper Islamic State or proper state was created. A state is one which has a flag, which has the capacity to generate revenues, which has its own judicial system, which has a law enforcement agency. So they had everything of that kind. They were generating revenues because they had occupied oil fields. And we know that
looted a bank in Iraq,
and
they had about $2 billion at that time in cash.
And we know that there was a head of this Islamic State, Junaid Baghdadi, self-styled caliph, who was later killed. So there was a proper hierarchy, a proper state, which qualified as a state. It had all the systems there. Once they were destroyed or defeated in Syria and Iraq, actually they were in Syria because this was Islamic State in Syria, in Sham. So that is why they have their Arabic acronym Daesh. So when it was defeated there, most of these people ran away to other places. What exists in Afghanistan is actually a franchise, as you yourself said. It is Islamic State Khorasan chapter. So what connections do they have with the original so-called caliphate, one doesn't know. And as you yourself pointed out, there are no more than 6,000 or maybe 7,000 people who are active members of IS Khorasan chapter. How are they organized? What is the order of battle? What is their presence within Afghanistan?
And who is supporting them, financing them? From where are they getting the ammunition and the weapons?
Funding, weapons, ammunition, command and control system. It is all very vague, ambiguous, hazy. Nobody is very sure. You said that they have been deployed along the border with Pakistan. Perhaps that's true. What is their presence along the border with Iran? What is their presence in the central Hazara Jats, where the Hazara people live? Is there any presence of this IS in the Wakhan Panhandle? Because that is the one which borders on China, and China has worries. China has very clearly told the Taliban that they will help them provided they make sure that their ground does not serve as a safe haven for any of non-state actors like the IS. So people are worried. We know that last year there was a conference of intelligence chiefs in which the intelligence chief of Pakistan, China, Russia, and one other country, probably Iran, they participated, and they clearly identified as the IS threat. But I am still at a loss to say that where do their handlers sit? Do they still sit in Syria or Iraq, or they sit in Europe or maybe North America? Who is
Tughral, before I go to our guest in Moscow, sir, I'll put another question to you, and that is important because that makes a lot of sense. Sir, I remember when this phenomena of Daesh or IS, Islamic State of IS as they used to call it, Islamic State of Iran and Iraq and Syria. Sir, these members were hardcore, number one. The way they killed the Muslims and wipe out villages, and especially if you look at it, the way they in fact killed the, which we call the Yazidis. I mean, it was unbelievable, sir. Interestingly, sir, they used to slaughter people, they used to kill them, like the whole village. They would pick up their women, they would rape them. This is all what we have witnessed over a period. Forced marriages were occurring, women were being sold out also. So the real phenomena, sir, at that time, if you remember, when this resistance started against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, against Syria, and Russia in fact came in for the support of the Syrian regime, and the Americans were in fact on the other side. The French and the British were also supporting them. Sir, at that time, these people were called the rebels. And I still remember all the American equipment to shoot down any helicopter or jet. They had all those American, sophisticated weapons. And suddenly, sir, we got to know that this is ISIS. Those rebels, whether they were Kurds or otherwise, they become a part. Once they became a part, sir, it seems that perhaps the rebels, or the support which the rebels got from the Western world, in fact was the reason that this Daesh phenomena was created. Is this correct?
Faisal Sahab, you are quite right. We know that Syria has been a terrible mix cocktail where various states have been involved. Russia has been involved, the United States of America has been involved, Turkey has been involved,
Iran, Saudi Arabia, you name it. I mean.
Everybody has been involved, and everybody had his own favorite non-state actors, and they called them by whatever name they chose. So in this terrible mix-up of conflicting ideas and ideologies and support groups, the IS prospered and flourished. And IS was controlling a very large area,
indeed, sir,
including oil fields. So they were not a small entity.
In the northern side of Iraq.
Absolutely. They had even gone into Algeria. So the IS was a very, very large entity. But when the powerful nations realized that this is becoming a demon for all of them, then they started fighting against it. And when and as you very rightly mentioned, that they were ruthless killers. They killed the Yazidis, made their women sex slaves, and all kinds of nonsense which is inhuman. So if these people were behaving like inhumans, then there must be some terrible ideology that must be guiding them. It doesn't happen like that, that suddenly somebody goes and starts killing somebody. There must be some very, very virulent ideology which must have been their guiding principle to motivate all these people. And many of them came from Europe.
Germany, UK.
Absolutely. They came from Europe and they had their own ideas. Perhaps they were rebelling against their own societies, their own cultures, and all of them were not second generation Europeans. They were not all of them could trace their descent from Asia.
Sir, mostly from the northern part of Africa.
Yeah, okay. There were people with heritage from Africa and Asia, but many of them were Europeans. They were white people, so they were rebelling against their own societies, and they were finding a regime which perhaps gave them a motive and incentive to go on a killing spree. So they were.
This is exactly what we witnessed, sir?
Yeah, absolutely. They were satiating their human urges, and they were girls also. You know, this Sharifa Begum was someone, a Bengali girl who
from Bangladesh.
Who was British, Bengali girl from Britain. She came over, and many girls ran away and came to Syria and married these people because they wanted to prove a point. Later on, they found out that they were not proving a point. They were actually misguided, or they became bonded slaves. Or
this is exactly what most of them got killed also, sir.
Many of them got killed also.
Yeah,
sure.
So now coming to you, Dr. Andrey. Now, first of all, sir, sitting in Moscow and thinking what's happening in Afghanistan in particular, sir, and trying to figure out that who is behind these certain non-state actors, these groups. Today, I learned that Mr. Vladimir Putin, his visit to India, and perhaps a lot is going to happen. Sir, we believe as Pakistanis, and our intelligence sources clearly indicate that certain non-state actors, very dangerous ones, are supported, financed, equipped, and are also assigned targets to hit. And that is all happening through India. Perhaps during the last 20 years, when the Indian presence was very, very obvious, and that was perhaps a clear and present danger itself in Afghanistan, sir, and we have presented so many dossiers. So don't you think that this is the time when a threat is also posed to the Russians, whether through Chechnya or otherwise, through the softer belly of these Central Asian states, as we call that, the softer belly of Russia? So don't you think that this should also be a part of the discussions between Narendra Modi, the PM of India, and the President Vladimir Putin, whom we all admire and we really look up to him? I think he is one of the best leaders of the recent times. Your take, sir?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And let me start with trying to distinguish between various fundamentalists. What is the basic, profound difference between Taliban and ISK? The difference, in my view, is that Taliban is a group of Afghan nationalists. You can even argue that they are Pashtun nationalists, while ISK is an international group of terrorists. They don't have a particular allegiance to any territory. They can operate in Syria today, they can go to Libya tomorrow, they can find themselves in Afghanistan the day after tomorrow. Wherever they have an opportunity, they will move there. So I think that definitely there can be no peace between Taliban and the ISK. And moreover, I would argue that Taliban leaders are likely to be the first targets of ISK, especially moderate Taliban leaders, rather than foreign nationals and foreign countries. So the danger which I see right now in Afghanistan is that with the deterioration of the economic and social situation in the country, Taliban might start losing popularity, and ISK might position itself as an alternative to Taliban, as a group of people which sticks to a more pure fundamentalist ideology. They will accuse Taliban of making compromises, and they will try to replace Taliban as the legitimate leadership of the country. And the danger is that if Taliban fails to reach beyond the Pashtun community in the country, national minorities like Tajiks and Uzbeks and others might be seduced by ISK to join their ranks. Now, let me say just a couple of words about India. You mentioned the danger that might come from the territory of India, and I agree with you that some of the ISK cells might be located on the Indian soil. However, we should not forget that India itself is very vulnerable to international terrorism. If you remember the history of Afghanistan, the Indian embassy was object of two major terrorist attacks some 10 years ago. And right now what we see in India is a network of the so-called Akis, Al-Qaeda Indian subcontinent, which builds itself cells quite actively in various parts of India. So I think that India should also be very concerned about international terrorism. India should join forces with other nations, including Russia and Pakistan and Central Asia, in order to confront this threat. It would be suicidal for Indians to support IKS. I don't think that it is in Indian interests to render any kind of assistance to this terrorist organization.
Now, Mr. Andrey, since you were talking about the difference between the Afghan Taliban and the Daesh, the Afghan Taliban perhaps, their design or their ideology is not beyond the borders of Afghanistan. They just wanted that the foreign troops, in particular the Americans and the NATO troops, should leave America on ASAP basis, which happened. But certainly, sir, we all thought that the war has been won by the Taliban against the Americans, and the Americans, really had to, exit in a hurry. And that is something which we all witnessed. But perhaps, sir, they had not lost the war. They had their own proxies there in the region also, sir. The only reason to invade Afghanistan wasn't to eliminate Al-Qaeda. That was eliminated much earlier, if you remember, and look at the statements issued by their former Secretary of States and the defense secretaries, etc. But what my point is, sir, that the presence of ISK means a threat to the entire region, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, or perhaps Turkmenistan, as I earlier mentioned, and the Muslim states in all. But, sir, their ideology is like to have this Khorasan. And Khorasan means that the entire India and Pakistan and a lot of area and region. Now, do you think they have that kind of a support even now, that they can actually dominate with that number, which is around 6,000 to 8,000, as they say? Perhaps it could be more, let's put it 10,000. Can they be a potential threat to the Afghan Taliban now, who are loaded with all sorts of latest weapons? And it is believed that around 85,000 billion worth of weapons are with the Taliban. Their number is around 70,000. They have their regime. I will not call it a government yet, since it has not been recognized so far by any country. Do you think they can eliminate that threat? Because Al-Qaeda's presence was there. It is just like, a person who can, have a certain mindset, but he can work for various companies, company A, B, or C.
That's right.
Overall, the perspective is the same. Dr. Saab.
If I might, I think that the real danger for Taliban is not the current activities of ISK, but rather the humanitarian disaster which might happen in the country. Because if it happens, then loyalties of the population will shift away from Taliban. Right now, there are expectations in Afghanistan that somehow Taliban can fix economic and social problems. And this is extremely difficult to do, especially when the West froze some of the assets of Afghanistan in international financial institutions. So there are clear shortages of fuel and food and basic medicines. And if it continues to deteriorate, then ISK will have a chance. They will say, Taliban failed to deliver, we can do better. So you folks should support us, not Taliban. And that will be.
But Dr. Andrey, that is not going to be acceptable to the people of Afghanistan. They don't even, majority of the people. And sir, when we talk about the demographics of any country, sir, look at the young population. Let's forget about those who are under the age of 35. I'm talking about those who were even born in 2000 and onwards, 2001 onwards. Perhaps, sir, and that number, who grew up when the Americans were there, and they saw the internet and the mobile phones and whatever the modern world had. And those kids have a different mindset. Whether girls or boys, they were used to going to different schools. But this phenomenon of the Taliban, let's keep it aside for a moment. But the IS, perhaps, is not going to be acceptable to the people, sir. What does that mean? Does it mean that there is going to be a civil war-like situation in Afghanistan if the Taliban, they fail to deliver being in the government, and it could give a boost to the non-state actors such as ISK, perhaps?
You're absolutely right. Afghanistan is very different from what it was 20 years ago. There was a very rapid process of urbanization, and of course, there were changes in the gender balance and in the educational level of the country. However, I think that if you take rural areas of Afghanistan, they still are quite conservative. And I would argue that ISK would like to exploit these rural areas rather than large urban places like Kabul, Herat, and other big cities. And this is the danger. The danger is that they will make full use of these traditionalist sections of the country. And this is a social base for Taliban. but it might become the social base, especially in the north and in the east of the country. It might become a formidable social base for ISK.
You heard what Dr.
Yes, I heard what he was saying, and I quite agree with him in many respects. ISK is not the main threat. If I was Mullah Hassan Akhund and I was sitting in Kabul as the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Taliban-led Afghanistan, and my cabinet was sitting with me, and I would ask them, what is the main threat? They will not tell me that ISK is the main threat. They will say poverty, hunger, insolvency. They don't have money. The Americans have frozen their assets.
Economic issues are perhaps the biggest threat at the moment.
Absolutely. The biggest threat is not ISK. And as you very correctly pointed out, ISK has the hell would freeze over before ISK become the masters of Afghanistan. And the ISK has not the capability of taking over Pakistan. God forbid, they don't have that capability. They are in very small number.
Because they in fact invaded those areas of those countries who were already, badly hurt because of the war. Iraq, totally destroyed. Syria, even the worst case scenario.
Yes. And you see, in Syria or Iraq, they were still very familiar with the terrain because most of them were Arabs, Syrians or Iraqis. Here, they're Afghans or Pakistanis. They are not natives. They are not, so to speak, sons of the soil. So they do not have any affinity with any ethnic group, whether it's Tajik, Uzbeks, Pashtuns, Hazaras.
But sir, don't you think a bundle of dollars can change everything?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Not in that way. Then if you give them bundles of dollars, then you will run away like Ashraf Ghani with money bags. You will be there for a very small time. So I very sincerely believe that the Taliban's problem is not ISK. ISK only has the capacity and wherewithal to create chaos. They would try to destabilize the Taliban. And if they are able to, are successful, God forbid, in that, then it will create problems of Pakistan because then there will be a deluge of refugees. Before that, I don't think anything can happen. So with Pakistan and all other regional countries trying to support Afghanistan, despite all the international reservations about their recognition, no country has recognized the Taliban. Pakistan wants to desperately recognize Afghanistan.
Even the Chinese are waiting for Pakistan to recognize and then they'll follow us.
So we are just... we want a few more countries to agree with us, maybe Russia one day or China one day or Iran one day, say, okay, let's accept them. Because we have to give them a legal cover of acceptance. We have to support them. We have to provide them finances. We have to rebuild the country. And therein lies our salvation. And if we are able to recreate or resurrect the society which has been destroyed by bombing and by other activities, then it would become very difficult for the ISK to find a foothold in this country. I don't think they have a foothold right now. Yes, they are on a killing spree. Yes, they are targeting Shia mosques.
Sir, we have seen few walls where this presence of Daesh was felt, even in Pakistan and cities.
I know that.
So if somebody was doing the wall chalking, perhaps he was told to do so.
Yes, you can give them money. That is where the dollars come in. You say, okay, buddy, you have...
So at the end of the day,
you have $10.
Dollars do matter, sir.
They matter, but for these smaller things, you don't have commitment. You see, when I say Ashraf Ghani ran away with millions of dollars because he did not have the commitment to fight for his country. That is why Afghan National Army surrendered without fighting a single bullet, because they knew that no matter how many dollars that we have, this country or this regime is not worthy of being defended. So
all right. Sir, we've also been joined in by Mr. Kamran Yousaf, senior analyst, journalist, anchor person, writer. Kamran Saab, pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Now we were talking about the presence of ISK in Afghanistan, and we were talking about the magnitude of threat they are posing. Now, Kamran Saab, you always write about it. I read your articles. Now, tell us a very important factor, sir. How bigger the threat of IS is for Afghanistan and Pakistan, one. And secondly, sir, if you believe for a second that the Western powers, they have accepted the regime of the Taliban, their funds are no more frozen, they are released, and some sort of very crucial help also arrives. Do you think that kind of a strategy is going to really help the Afghan Taliban or the regime of the Taliban to counter this threat, sir? Your take.
Well, first of all, as far as the threat is concerned from the ISK, we have to look at it this way. You know, the ISK or Daesh Khorasan has a different strategy. You know that they always, target even the civilians. And in that sense, of course, that they can create a lot more mayhem than other militant groups who maybe, like, for example, Afghan Taliban or the Haqqani network, when the US and the international forces were there before the Doha agreement, they were usually targeting, those military targets or the Afghan security forces. But here, Daesh is not discriminating between the security forces and the civilians. So in that sense, they can create a lot of havoc. But as far as their organized structure is concerned, Afghan Taliban, if you compare it with the Afghan Taliban, of course, that they were controlling large swaths of territory in Afghanistan. Daesh is not controlling that kind of territory. So in that sense, and the other factor, since the Taliban now are in charge, the main question is where Daesh would get all the fundings. For example, Pakistan is against Daesh. Iran is also against Daesh. Russia is also worried about the threat posed by Daesh. China also is worried. So they will be facing a lot of problems in terms of funding. So in that sense, if you take these things into account, Daesh threat can be met if other regional countries, as the second point that you mentioned, support Afghan Taliban. And I think that is the major point where countries like Iran, countries like Russia, which previously opposed Afghan Taliban, they settled, if you can call it, a lesser evil. They believe that Afghan Taliban are lesser evil if you compare it with Daesh. So that is why they are cooperating with Afghan Taliban. And even the US also feels that they are on the same page with Afghan Taliban when it comes to fighting Daesh. Now, how that can be done if Afghan Taliban, is grappling with dealing with the humanitarian issues, dealing with the economic issues because of the lack of funding, then Daesh can make serious inroads. For example, as they say that empty stomach, can provide a breeding ground to groups like Daesh to lure common Afghans. So to avoid that kind of scenario, of course, that Afghanistan not only needs humanitarian assistance, but I think they also need economic assistance. They also need investment so that their economy is revived. If their economy is revived, then of course Afghan Taliban or the government in Kabul will be in a better position, not just to deal with the governance issues, but also the threat posed by Daesh.
But Kamran, at the same time, we always talk about this conducive environment for doing business, and then the conducive environment to grow a certain crop, that environment, that ecosystem that supports that particular agenda. Now my point, sir, is in fact related to the current Afghan situation, sir, where if there is poverty, if there are no jobs, people are dying of hunger. I'm just portraying a very worst case scenario here, sir. These frozen funds are not given to the Taliban, regime is not accepted, harsh winter is there. So, sir, don't you think that is going to be a breeding ground for these non-state actors, one? And secondly, when you talk about the number of ISK, whether it's 6,000, 4,000 or 8,000, God knows, sir, because they are all camouflaged, you believe that they could be a potential threat for Pakistan? Because whenever I watch the Indian channels or I listen to the arguments of the hawkish, I would say, guests and these decision makers in India, they say that the situation in Afghanistan should remain the same or it should get worse, so that Pakistan should not have that kind of an influence in Afghanistan. Perhaps they really want to make sure that Pakistani influence shouldn't be there in Afghanistan. The Pakistani state thinks that the Indian influence should be minimized. And at the end of the day, perhaps if these two countries are still engaging in this sort of a confrontation, eventually it is going to help these non-state actors. And on top, if the Indians very clearly admit that the Taliban regime is not acceptable to them, so obviously, sir, they will be supporting all the groups which are anti-Taliban, anti-Afghan Taliban, let me put it this way. So perhaps those groups, whether in the form of TTP in some areas, or Daesh, or ISK, or perhaps these splinter groups of Pakistani Taliban there as well, sir? And they could be looked after, and they could be, converted into a potential and serious threat for the entire region. How do you see that aspect?
Well, let me answer the last question first. As far as the India's approach is concerned, if you look at it in recent months, I think that they are now following a pragmatic approach. Of course, that they are not openly embracing the Afghan Taliban, but in a way, if you see even before this withdrawal, their officials were having direct talks with the Afghan Taliban representatives in Doha. So, and also given the fact that that India wanted to donate or transport 50,000 metric tons of wheat and other goods via Pakistan, and if you see that the acting foreign minister who recently visited Pakistan, he himself requested Prime Minister of Pakistan to let Indian food grain pass through Wagah border. So that also shows that there are certain level of contacts between Afghan Taliban and, of course, India. So we have to look this thing in mind as well. As far as this Daesh threat for Pakistan is concerned, of course that Daesh is a threat, but I don't think so that the threat level is same as currently facing by the Afghan Taliban or Afghanistan, given the fact that Daesh Khorasan has their organized infrastructure currently inside Afghanistan, so they do not have organized infrastructure inside Pakistan. Yes, there are individuals and people who may be inspired by Daesh ideology, but they do not have the organized structure here in Pakistan. So if we, for example, at the moment, Pakistan is trying to negotiate a peace deal, for example, like the banned Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So if we are able to woo certain reconcilable elements within the TTP, that may also, weaken Daesh, because then our focus will be particularly on Daesh, because one threat, of course, that we call it the TTP, may be over. And the third thing that you spoke about, of course, the issue of humanitarian crisis and also the lack of funding, I think that is where the international community needs to take a clear decision. At the moment, it appears that they are trying to draw a fine balance. On one hand, they are saying that, yes, we are worried about the humanitarian situation. We want to help the people of Afghanistan, but we cannot do it through the Afghan Taliban. I think they need to shed this double standard. Either, I think they should, in a way, if they do not formally want to recognize the Taliban government, but I think they should be very clear, apart from the humanitarian assistance, U.S. should unfreeze $9.5 billion foreign assets of Afghanistan so that it helps the current dispensation in Kabul to run their country more effectively. Then also they need to lift other sanctions and restrictions, because currently you know that even formal banking channels are not operating. People are struggling, to send money to their loved ones, because you know that there are lots of overseas Afghans who want to send money back to their loved ones, but because of the sanctions and other issues, they cannot do so. So I think the international community needs to take a clear decision. If they really want to help the people of Afghanistan, they need to accept the reality that Taliban, yes, they are in power. So if they want to help the people of Afghanistan, they need to follow a holistic approach rather than the selective approach. Yes, we only want to help the people of Afghanistan, but not to give the legitimacy to the Afghan Taliban. I think this policy will not work.
Kamran Sahab, before I let you go, last comment I want to hear from you, and that is about the visit of the Russian president to India and that very important meeting between the two leaders. Don't you think the issue of Afghanistan should also be on agenda, so other than selling the defense assets and all to India from the Russians?
I think it is a foregone conclusion. Afghanistan must be one of the issues or regional issues both President Putin and the Indian Prime Minister must have discussed. Because you know that Russia is one of the leading players now in Afghanistan. They have good relations with Afghan Taliban, and unlike the past, that they are now following a very pragmatic approach. They are critical of the U.S. policies, and I'm sure that this issue must have been discussed between the two leaders. India must have, given their own perspective about these issues. But Russia, of course, that their approach when it comes to Afghanistan, they are more closer to Pakistan. In fact, I would say, go a step further, both Pakistan and Russia are actually on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan. India, on the other hand, appears a misfit because it still has a different approach to deal with, and that is why I think realizing other regional players having more pragmatic approach, even India is now compelled to reach out to the Afghan Taliban.
Exactly.
But because of the domestic pressures, they are not doing it at the moment more openly.
All right. Thank you so much, Kamran, for your comments. Now, there is another important factor, and that is about the narrative. I think this is exactly a very important point which was raised by Kamran Yousaf, where he said that, interestingly, when you look at the kind of an approach adopted by the Russians, obviously, sir, they can't afford to have NATO on one side and, the extremists are right under their belly. So they would try to eliminate the issue of Chechnya, those black widows and all. We have witnessed those two, the kind of attacks, which the Russians have seen, the kind of killings, whether in the cinema or otherwise. So that is something which is worrisome for them. Vladimir Putin, sir, I think is the best thing ever happened to Russia, to be very honest. This man means business. He is articulate. He understands. Since he's been the KGB chief, he exactly knows what's going on. And he's one of the most powerful leaders in the world. And you can't take Russia lightly. The question now, sir, on this particular visit, since Kamran was mentioning that the narrative of Pakistan, or so-called the overall way to handle the issue of Afghanistan is very similar. This is exactly what the Russians want. This is what Pakistan, and this is convergence. Whereas, sir, when it comes to India, don't you think this is the time when the Russians need to also tell their friends, India, that if certain non-state actors are supported by the Indians, which is going to be in total contradiction of what we want, that shouldn't be done. Do you think India will do that, or just to follow their own agenda to make Pakistan bleed via that side, as long as the situation in Afghanistan remains chaotic or in turmoil, that is going to support the ideology of the Indians to hurt Pakistan. Perhaps they are very close to Afghan people or otherwise, but that aspect you cannot eliminate, because this is exactly what they have invested for 20 years, sir. Come on.
Faisal Saab, Afghanistan will be on the agenda of talks between Putin and Modi. But in international relations, every country has its own interests.
Correct.
India's interest is that the Taliban, despite the fact that they have sent 50,000 tons of wheat to them via Pakistan, their agenda basically is that the Afghan Taliban remain unsettled. They don't want them to stabilize. Russia wants a stable Afghanistan because you see the threat for Russia right now is not IS. The threat for them is on the borders of Ukraine. The threat for them is they are in an eyeball-to-eyeball situation with NATO. They have withdrawn
Look at the recent development.
Absolutely. They have withdrawn their mission from NATO. They had members sitting there.
So G8 to G7
absolutely.
is right in front of you.
They are out of the big league because they are not invited anymore. But the main fact is that the NATO chief is saying that the situation is nightmarish, and Antony Blinken has met Sergei Lavrov to actually reduce tension. But the fact of the matter is that the situation is very tense in Europe. So Russia is not spoiling for war, but Russia is very, very alert in Europe.
Sir, they have said that, if you will cross this red line, we will retaliate, that is going to be a kinetic retaliation.
Right. But they are not going to do that. Neither the NATO is going to do that. It is posturing because both sides...
Just like the situation in the South China Sea.
Absolutely. They are not going to fight, but they are going to posture. Russians have sent their nuclear armed bombers into the air. Belarus has tried to weaponize the migrants and have tried to push them into Poland. So a lot of things are happening in Europe. Russia would not like to open another
And
front
the
in
latest
Afghanistan.
meeting in Latvia also.
Right, right. So the situation is tense in Europe. Both sides are very tense. Putin has said very clearly that he is not going to accept any further eastward push of NATO towards Russia or countries which are
As they
under
say,
Russian
when
influence.
the push comes to shove, Russians won't be
Right.
quiet.
They've already, in 2014, they've already annexed
Crimea, yeah.
Crimea, yes, absolutely. So, but their attention is diverted towards Europe. They would, India has its own agenda. India is part of the Quad. They are part of the strategic.
Well, sir, that is also a very important factor. And look at the arrangement regarding AUKUS and so on and so forth. But anyway, interesting times ahead, as I always say.
Best of time and worst of times. But Putin, as you said, shrewd man, clever man.
A couple of days, I think, would be very important. Let's see if the joint statement comes out and this particular agenda was on table. So what sort of solution has been provided?
I'll tell you what the joint statement is going to be. If you are interested in Afghanistan, both of them will say that we want peace in Afghanistan. But in their hearts of heart, Russia has another peace in mind, and the Indians have another kind of peace.
It's a different approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. What Modi is thinking is different. What Putin is thinking is different.
All right.
So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure to.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much.
You know, it is always pleasure for us to, have you in our show, sir.
Thank you so much.
So kind of you. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you inshallah tomorrow at 8:05. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.